Well, we've got here a cairn, a stone cairn, a curved cairn dating back to about 3000 BC. Initially, we know that people moved along the Solway, probably from Glenluce, and stopped off at the various river valleys and similar places to settle because of overpopulation at Glenluce. And I believe the definition of overpopulation was something like 60 people. But anyway, they came along the Solway, they went up the Cree, the Fleet. They couldn't get up the Dee, still can't get up it today because of the rockfalls. And they came up the Are. Well, we're very near the Are here anyway. And we reckon they came up the valley at Portling, inland here, and they came across this loch, which then was about 3/4 of a mile long and about 500 metres wide. And their first action really was to drain the southern end of the loch, partly to get ground for growing crops, because they obviously recognised it had a very nice clay base, and also to give them some sort of sassin, or give them something to own. So they built a cairn, and the cairn would have been a type of territorial marker initially. This is around about 3000 BC, 2900, somewhere about there. And this would go on for several hundred years without anyone really arguing the toss about who owned what and who was clearing what land. And the territorial marker, of course, was there, the equivalent of your sassin, something of the sort. And eventually things obviously got a little bit tighter. People were maybe arguing, and they had to decide how they could prove that the territorial marker was their property. And the easy way was, in fact, was to bury your dead in it. So round about, we think, 2700 BC, we find the first passage burial inserted into this particular cairn. It was an inhumation burial. It was bones into a chamber, and we have found, I think, 4 flint tools in the immediate vicinity of the chamber, which is now collapsed. You then get a gap of probably 500-600 years. We don't know whether the people were using the cairn, what was going on, but we do know that by 2150 BC we have got a new type of burial being inserted into it, and that is the cremation burial. And what we have, the earliest ones we have here, are in about 2150 BC, and there's a series of, or a linear cemetery of large boat-shaped burials with the bows all pointing to the east. Obviously, the fact that they're pointing to the east shows that some form of ritual is being used in the burial sequence. With the rising of the sun, the spirit goes round and goes down in the west, probably into the water. We reckon prehistoric man was very ritually attached to water beings. We know they had the gods of earth, fire, water and air, and they seem to put a lot of count towards worshipping these people. So there's obviously a ritualistic side to the whole burial story. Then, as far as we can see, things changed a bit in the mid-Bronze Age, round about maybe 1500 BC. The burials begin to get smaller. There's still cremation. Some have got added annexes, which means that people have come back to them and added more cremation burials into them. But come 1159 BC, we have this terrible disaster taking place when Mount Hecla blew up and produced what can only be described as a nuclear winter. We know from the tree ring dating evidence that there was 18 years of solid rain. and with that, that would virtually wipe out the population if they stayed. So the hypothesis at the moment is that everybody moved south, as far as the Mediterranean, in fact, seeking better conditions. There'd be a very heavy casualty rate. Some might have got one or two people staying on in the caves on the coast, but they'd have a pretty restricted diet. It would be fish or birds, and that would be it. There'd be no cereals or anything like that, because that stuff couldn't grow. And we think then it took probably about 400 or 500 years for people to come back into the area. I don't think it was the same people who came back who left. I think there's a definite element of Central European people moving in, and they, of course, were known as the Keltoi, or the Celts. And so a whole new setup generally comes in with a whole lot of new ritual and everything else. But the fact is, the cairns must still have survived to an extent. Either that, or the people managed to get the water levels down again, drain the loch down to the sea. And what we have is a later series of burials. Interestingly, they respected the early burials, although they did put the later burials on top of them, but not in them. And so we've got several of the late Bronze Age, early Iron Age burials in place on top of the old linear cemetery. And we're talking somewhere around about 900, 800 BC, something of the sort, of a burial of that time. And there's a whole row of them here, which we took from the top of burials. They're a lot smaller than the early Bronze Age capstones, which are absolutely enormous. The likes of this one here is an early one. They get smaller as time progresses. It may well be that people just didn't have the time any longer to concentrate on large, fancy burials and big, hefty capstones. The whole thing changes to a much smaller burial with a smaller capstone, rather pointing to the fact that either the ritual has changed with these new people coming in from Central Europe, or they just didn't have the time to devote to this type of thing. And also, I suspect that the moving of these capstones had a lot to do with it, because we do know, or we're pretty sure, that the original large ones were moved by the actions of snow and ice. Now, after 1159, with the Hekla disaster, the whole climate changed. There wasn't any more snow and ice on a regular basis. Therefore, things like this could not be moved. So it evolved onto a smaller type burial. And this probably went through the Iron Age, which in Galloway was from about 600 BC into maybe 200 AD. And then it stops. There's no more evidence of burials being put onto the cairns. What we do have is evidence of settlement on the cairns, with a roundhouse, a sort of farmhouse, in other words. So we've got a farming community at this time, and they're probably growing crops, they're breeding cattle, they're catching fish, mainly to use as collateral, because this is the time of the Roman occupation. Now, we'd at times anything up to 8,000 Roman troops in Galloway, and they had to be fed. They had to have leather, they had to have salted fish, things like that. They needed food, they needed stuff for their equipment, and the hypothesis now is that the local people concentrated on that type of thing, rearing cattle, catching fish, etc, etc, etc. And your Roman sutler would come round in his wagon every so often, collect as much stuff as he possibly could, and pay for it in kind. As far as we know, there was little or no coinage here at that time, so it has to be metalwork, tripods, cooking pans, primitive weapons. The Romans wouldn't give them much in the way of weaponry, just in case they ever turned. And this is where we have good dating evidence here, because we've got a tintinnabulum that was used as a votive offering somewhere about 100, 200 AD, according to the dating from the British Museum. So that gives us a handy date for the use of the cairns. After that, it seems to go. There's no evidence of anything happening really until the Anglian era, when we've got the remains of an Anglian farmhouse on site. Then again, there's a gap once the Anglians leave and go back home to fight off the ravaging Norsemen. There seems to be a hiatus. There's a possible Viking connection, but the main connection is medieval. That round about 1170, 1180, under the Lords of Galloway, people were invited into Galloway to settle, to give night service, etc. And we think that this was one of their settlements then. It turned into a motte and bailey. We've got the cairn being raised in height while they put their buildings on it, because when we removed the floor of one building on this cairn, underneath it we found the first of the early Bronze Age burials, and that really is what started the Newbarns project.